The lobby of the luxury hotel was as polished and pristine as you would expect. Gleaming marble floors, elegant chandeliers, and a hushed atmosphere of sophistication. Guests drifted in and out, sipping on overpriced lattes, chatting in whispers as they passed by. At first glance, it looked like any other five-star hotel, a place where people came to escape, to indulge in a high life. But for one woman, this hotel would become the setting of an experience she would never forget, an experience that would change her life forever. It started like any other day for Ava. A professional woman in her late 20s, she had worked her way up the corporate ladder and, like so many, was simply looking for a quick, relaxing getaway after a particularly stressful work week. The reservation was made. She'd been promised luxury. She expected nothing less than perfection. But the moment she stepped into the lobby, Ava felt a cold shift in the air. The manager, a man named Richard, had greeted her with a forced smile. There was something unsettling about the way he looked her up and down, a subtle look of judgment hidden beneath his perfectly groomed exterior. Ava brushed it off. After all, she was just here for a peaceful stay, not a confrontation. But as she handed over her ID and credit card, she felt a strange tension building between them. The check-in process was far slower than it should have been. Richard's eyes never seemed to leave her, scanning her features in a way that made her uncomfortable. "I'm afraid we had an issue with your reservation," he said, his tone too casual, his eyes colder than the marble floors beneath them. Ava frowned. She had confirmed everything online. She had called ahead to make sure there were no issues. "Is there a problem?" she asked, trying to remain polite, but the discomfort was starting to bubble beneath the surface. "Well, it's not so much the reservation itself," Richard trailed off, looking away for a moment. Then he lowered his voice slightly, as though to make sure only she could hear. "It's just, we don't usually accommodate people like you." Ava froze. The words hung in the air, like a slap that took a moment to sting. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. Did he just say what she thought he said? Her mind raced as she tried to process the full meaning of his words. Was this a joke? Was he testing her patience? But Richard's expression remained cold and indifferent. There was no hint of humor, no sense of remorse in his eyes. The truth hit her then, like a punch in the gut. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an accident. He had said it, and he meant it. "I'm sorry." Ava managed to get the words out, but she felt like her throat had tightened. Richard gave a small, dismissive shrug. "You know, someone of your background." His words were dripping with condescension. Ava's pulse quickened as his meaning became painfully clear. He was making assumptions based on her skin color, her race. She was being judged before she had even been given a chance to step foot in a room. Ava's heart pounded in her chest. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and humiliated. But the anger was coming now. Quiet at first, but rising. This wasn't how she was going to let her weekend unfold. This wasn't how anyone should be treated, not in a place that prided itself on luxury and exclusivity. She could have walked away. She could have turned around and left, but she didn't. Ava wasn't the kind of person who backed down, not from anyone, not when it mattered. She had worked too hard for too long, and if this man thought he could break her with a few words, he was wrong. She stood her ground, looked him in the eye, and prepared for what was to come next. What Ava did next would leave Richard and the rest of the hotel staff stunned, and set the stage for a dramatic confrontation that no one in that lobby would ever forget. But how would it all unfold? Would she be able to take back control of her own dignity? Or would she be forced to walk away, humiliated in a place that claimed to offer nothing but luxury? This is only the beginning. And the next part of her story, her powerful response, is something you need to see to believe. Stay tuned. Ava's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. Her first instinct was to speak, to retaliate immediately, but there was something about Richard's smug, condescending look that made her hesitate. It was the kind of stare that felt like it was meant to intimidate, to make her second-guess herself. But deep down, Ava knew this wasn't about just her. It was about the countless others who had been treated the same way by people like Richard, whose power came from privilege and a belief that they could get away with it. She took a breath, steadying herself. This wasn't a battle she would fight with anger alone. She needed to stay calm. She needed to use her voice and her mind to make sure this didn't end with her walking away defeated. There was no way she was going to let this moment define her. "So, what exactly does that mean?" Ava asked, her voice steady but with an edge of defiance. She refused to show any weakness. Richard tilted his head, clearly enjoying the discomfort he had created. He leaned back slightly against the desk, as though he were an authority figure, and she was the one who had something to prove. "Look, I'm just saying, our clientele is, well, a certain type of person," he said, his eyes narrowing, his words dripping with judgment. "We like to maintain a certain standard around here." Ava felt a surge of heat rise in her chest. She had heard it all before, the euphemisms, the thinly veiled discrimination, the so-called standards that only seemed to apply to some people and not others. But she refused to let it slide. She had worked too hard to get here, not just in her career, but in life, to let this man make her feel small. "I think you've got me confused with someone else," she said, leaning in just slightly, her eyes locking with his. "I don't belong to any type. I'm just a person who made a reservation, just like anyone else." Richard scoffed, clearly expecting her to back down, but instead, Ava stood taller, her posture straight and unyielding. "I'm afraid there's nothing I can do about that," he muttered, swiping his hand over the desk dismissively. "You might want to check with our corporate office or, is that how you treat all your guests?" Eva interrupted, her voice unwavering. "Do you tell everyone that they don't belong? Or is it just me because of how I look?" The room seemed to freeze for a moment. For a second, it felt like time had stopped, like even the air around them was holding its breath. Richard blinked, clearly caught off guard. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, not in his own hotel. Ava could see the shift in his demeanor. His expression was no longer quite as confident, though he still held the reins of the situation. But something inside her told her she had finally rattled him. He cleared his throat, his eyes flicking around nervously before settling back on her. "You don't have to make a scene," he muttered, but the edge in his voice betrayed his discomfort. Ava was about to respond when she felt the eyes of the other guests in the lobby turning toward her. It wasn't a crowd, but enough of them were watching, some glancing, some openly staring, that she could feel the weight of their attention. There was no turning back now. It wasn't just her battle anymore. It was a stand, not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, unseen, or unwanted. She thought of the years she had spent fighting for her place in a world that often made her feel like she had to prove her worth over and over again. She thought of the countless times she had been told, directly or indirectly, that she didn't belong in certain spaces, that her presence was an inconvenience, that her skin was a barrier to the kind of luxury she was now being denied. Ava's mind flashed back to the early days of her career when she had walked into boardrooms with her head held high, determined to prove she was just as capable as anyone in the room, only to face the subtle, yet piercing, microaggressions that made it clear she wasn't fully accepted. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just one voice against a system. This was a confrontation. And Richard, this smug hotel manager, was the symbol of that system. "What are you going to do about it?" Ava asked, her voice calm but laced with a kind of intensity that sent a shiver through the air. Richard's eyes narrowed once more, but there was something different now. A crack in his facade. He wasn't as sure of himself as he had been moments earlier. "I don't know what you think you're trying to accomplish, but I can't change the rules," he said, his voice laced with a hint of defensiveness. "I'm not asking you to change the rules," Eva said. "I'm asking you to treat me like a person, like someone who has every right to be here, just like everyone else." There was a long pause, and for a moment, it seemed like Richard was going to push her further, maybe even tell her to leave. But just as he opened his mouth, the door to the back office swung open, and another staff member walked in. The woman, who appeared to be in her mid-30s, took one look at the situation and immediately noticed the tension in the air. Her eyes flicked between Ava and Richard, as though weighing what was going on. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her voice neutral, but her gaze sharp. She had the air of someone who had seen a lot and wasn't easily swayed by drama. Richard quickly turned toward the woman, straightening up. "There's a misunderstanding," he said, his voice a little too rehearsed now. "We were just discussing a situation with the guest's reservation." Ava could tell the woman wasn't buying it. She could see the subtle flicker of recognition in the staff member's eyes, as though she understood exactly what was happening. And just for a moment, Ava felt a small spark of hope. Maybe someone here saw the truth. Maybe she wasn't as alone in this fight as she had thought. But Richard, clearly uncomfortable with the way things were heading, took a step back. "Why don't we take this to the office?" he suggested, the words coming out too quickly, almost as if he were eager to move the conversation away from the prying eyes of the lobby. Ava didn't move. She didn't want to take this conversation anywhere. She wanted it right there, in front of everyone, where it couldn't be swept under the rug. She knew she couldn't let it go. But there was something else, something strange in the way the staff member was looking at her now. Was there more to this than just a rove manager? The tension in the air thickened. Ava's mind raced, trying to figure out how to navigate the next step. Would she stand her ground? Would Richard push her to the point where she had no choice but to leave? Or was there more to this story than she realized? The uncertainty lingered, hanging over her like a storm waiting to break. Ava stood there, her eyes locked on Richard as the woman who had just entered the room stood quietly by, observing the exchange. There was something about the way the staff member looked at her, like she was silently processing the situation, weighing her options. For a brief moment, Ava wondered if this woman would speak up, maybe even support her. But as Richard fumbled to control the situation, his eyes darting nervously between her and the new staff member, the truth began to settle in her mind. This wasn't just a matter of one bad employee. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the culture of the place. Ava was beginning to realize that what she was up against wasn't just Richard. It was something much bigger, something deeper. The staff member remained silent for a moment, her arms crossed loosely across her chest as she watched Richard carefully. Ava felt a rising sense of unease, wondering if this woman, too, was complicit in the system that had been built to exclude people like her. She couldn't help but feel like she was in the middle of some kind of silent standoff, no one willing to break the unspoken tension. For all the luxury and grace the hotel tried to project, this moment exposed its ugly underbelly. Ava wasn't just fighting Richard, she was fighting the very institution itself. "Maybe we should just step aside for a moment," Richard finally said, his voice much softer now, his earlier bravado completely gone. "There's been a mistake with your room. I'll get it fixed. Please just wait here for a moment." Ava felt the cold trickle of suspicion crawl up her spine. She had no idea what getting it fixed meant. He'd clearly been stalling, trying to buy time. For what? Was he hoping she'd just back down and accept the treatment, or was he waiting for the whole thing to blow over? Either way, he hadn't expected her to put up a fight. He hadn't expected her to challenge him. The woman by the door shifted, stepping toward Ava, her face still neutral, but with a slight softening of her gaze. She finally spoke, her voice low but clear. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the trouble. I'll make sure to handle this as soon as possible." She hesitated, looking at Richard and then back at Ava, almost as if deciding what her next move should be. "You're right," she added, her words catching in the air, making Ava's heart skip a beat. "You deserve better than this." Ava blinked, unsure if she had heard her correctly. She wasn't sure if the woman had just acknowledged the clear prejudice in the air, or if she was simply trying to smooth things over. But for the first time since she'd walked into the hotel, there was a small glimmer of hope. Richard shot a quick glance at the woman, his face tight with irritation. "I've got this covered," he snapped, as though trying to reassert control over the situation. He was clearly uncomfortable, but the presence of another staff member seemed to unsettle him more. The staff member didn't budge, though. She looked back at Ava, giving her a brief, almost imperceptible nod before turning toward Richard. "I'll handle it from here," she said, her voice firm. "You've done enough." Ava's pulse quickened. There was more to this. Something was happening beneath the surface, something she didn't fully understand yet. She had no idea if this woman was on her side or if she was just another part of the system, but in that moment, Ava chose to trust her. There was a fleeting moment of uncertainty, one where she could have walked away or accepted the situation for what it seemed to be, but Ava's gut told her there was more at play here than just one man's prejudice. She didn't know why, but she felt like this woman was a key to uncovering the truth. Before she could respond, Richard turned and walked away without another word, disappearing behind a set of glass doors leading to the back office. The staff member exhaled deeply, her shoulders tense, before finally turning toward Ava. "I'm sorry you had to experience that," she said quietly, her voice softening. "This isn't how we're supposed to treat our guests." Ava wasn't sure what to make of this. She didn't know this woman, didn't even know her name, but there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't just apologizing out of duty. There was sincerity there. And Ava, despite the confusion swirling in her mind, decided to push past her uncertainty. If this woman was willing to stand up to Richard, maybe she could get to the bottom of what was really going on at this hotel. "I don't get it," Ava said, her voice calm but filled with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Why would he say something like that? Why'd he treat me like that?" The staff member sighed, her eyes flickering with something Ava couldn't quite place. "It's complicated," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This hotel has its ways, and people like Richard have been in charge for a long time. He thinks he's untouchable, but he's not." Ava felt a rush of relief. Someone, at least, was willing to acknowledge what had happened. But she still had questions, too many questions. Why had Richard acted like that? Why had he felt so comfortable treating her that way? And who was this woman, really? Was she just a bystander, or was there more to her involvement in this? "What's your name?" Ava asked, her voice more cautious now. The staff member hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting quickly toward the door Richard had disappeared through. "Grace," she finally said. "I'm Grace." "Grace," Ava repeated. "What's really going on here? Why did he think he could treat me that way?" Grace glanced around, as though making sure no one was listening, before she leaned in slightly. "There's more to Richard than just being rude," she said, her voice low, almost like a whisper. "This hotel, it's not just about luxury. There's a lot of money involved, a lot of power, and people like Richard, he's got connections. People like him can get away with a lot more than they should." Ava's stomach churned as she processed Grace's words. Power, connections, what was she saying? Was this hotel involved in something bigger than just customer service? Was Richard's behavior a reflection of something much darker, lurking beneath the surface? Grace's eyes flicked toward the back office again, and Ava saw the unease in her face. It was clear Grace was more than just a low-level employee. She knew something about the hotel, about Richard, maybe even about the system of privilege and discrimination that had allowed this to happen. But Ava could sense she wasn't ready to fully reveal what she knew. Not yet, at least. "Look," Grace said, standing up straighter, her voice hardening. "I've said enough. For now, just wait here. I'll try to get this sorted out." Before Ava could respond, Grace turned and walked toward the back office, leaving Ava standing in the lobby, her mind swirling with more questions than answers. What had she just uncovered? Was this the beginning of something that would change everything she knew about the hotel? And was Grace really on her side, or was she just another player in this game? The tension was thick, suffocating. Ava knew one thing for sure. The truth was buried here, somewhere in the shadows, and she was going to find it. Ava sat in the quiet, opulent lobby, her mind spinning. The marble floors gleamed under the low light, But the beauty of the hotel felt distant now, almost hollow. She couldn't shake the sense that there was something sinister lurking behind the polished exterior, something no amount of luxury could hide. Grace had left, disappearing into the back office with a hurried step, and Ava was left alone with her thoughts. She tried to piece together what she'd learned in the brief exchange, but everything felt fragmented, as if she were only seeing part of the picture. The minutes dragged on, and Ava's eyes flicked nervously toward the door to the back office. Every few seconds, she half expected Grace to emerge, her expression full of apology and explanation, but instead, time seemed to stretch on endlessly. Her patience was wearing thin. What was taking so long? Was Grace really trying to fix things, or was she just buying time? Maybe she was being careful. Maybe she didn't want to get caught up in something bigger than herself. The uncertainty gnawed at Ava, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized how dangerous this situation had become. The thought crossed her mind again. What if Richard had more control than she realized? What if his hotel, this place that promised nothing but the finest accommodations, was built on more than just wealth? Ava couldn't ignore the possibility that there was something darker at play here, something that Richard had been hiding behind his polished smile and stiff uniform. She'd felt it when she first walked into the lobby, the coldness, the judgment. It was as though her presence was an inconvenience to the whole operation, and Richard had done everything in his power to remind her of it. She stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. The walls of the lobby suddenly seemed like they were closing in on her. The pristine furniture, the polished marble, it was all too perfect, too rehearsed. Ava couldn't help but feel that the elegance of the place was just a facade, masking something ugly. She had to know more. She couldn't leave without answers. Her pulse quickened as she walked toward the glass doors that led to the back office. She had to see for herself what was going on back there. If Grace was really on her side, she would find a way to get Ava the truth. If Richard was part of something bigger, something more corrupt, Ava needed to know. She could feel the tension rising in her chest as she approached the doors. Just as she reached for the handle, the door swung open, and Grace stepped out. Her face was unreadable, her expression guarded. Ava froze, caught in the moment, but Grace didn't seem surprised to see her there. Instead, she looked around quickly, as though checking for anyone who might be watching, before speaking in a low voice. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her tone urgent. "You need to go back to the lobby, now." Ava's heart skipped a beat. What's going on? What did you find out? Grace's eyes flickered nervously to the hallway behind her. There was no one around, but Ava could tell that something had shifted. Grace was no longer the calm, apologetic employee she had been earlier. She was tense, anxious. I can't tell you everything right now. It's too risky." She paused, her gaze darting around again, then lowered her voice even further. "Richard's not just a manager. He's part of something much bigger, something dangerous. And it's not just him. The people he works with, they have power, real power, more than you can imagine." Ava's stomach lurched at the words. Dangerous, power. This was no longer just a matter of poor customer service or prejudice. It was something deeper, something Ava hadn't anticipated. She could feel the weight of Grace's words hanging in the air, thick with the promise of secrets yet to be revealed. "What do you mean?" Ava asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. "What are they involved in?" Grace bit her lip, clearly wrestling with herself. For a moment, Ava thought she might refuse to say more, but then Grace leaned in closer, lowering her voice even further. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Grace asked, her eyes widening. "The way Richard treated you, the way he treated me. It's all part of it, the way they see certain people, the way they've been trained to believe they're better, that they deserve to keep control. It's not just about the hotel anymore. It's about maintaining that control at all costs." Ava felt a chill crawl down her spine as the realization began to sink in. This wasn't just about one man's prejudice. This was about power, about a system designed to keep certain people in their place. a system that had been allowed to thrive under the guise of luxury, of service, the very same system that Richard was enforcing with his cold attitude and casual cruelty. Grace's voice dropped even lower, barely a whisper now. You can't trust anyone here. Not anyone. If they find out you're asking questions, it won't end well for you. Ava's mind raced. She was trapped in a place that was as much a symbol of wealth and influence as it was a battleground for something far darker. She could feel the weight of the danger pressing in on her from all sides, but something inside her refused to back down. She wasn't going to be silenced. She wasn't going to let Richard, or anyone else, get away with this. I'm not going anywhere, Ava said, her voice firmer than she had intended. I need to know the truth. I'm not leaving until I get it. Grace's eyes softened for just a moment, but then the fear returned. She glanced back at the hallway one more time, then took a deep breath. You don't understand. They'll come for you. They won't stop until you're out of the picture. Ava shook her head, the resolve building inside her. I've dealt with people like them before. I've been knocked down, but I always get back up. If they want me gone, they're going to have to make me leave. For a brief moment, Grace just stared at her, as though weighing the consequences of what she was about to say. Finally, she sighed and nodded. You're right, but you need to be careful. Richard's not the only one watching you. They've got eyes everywhere. If you keep pushing, things could get dangerous. You won't be able to undo what you started. Ava felt the weight of Grace's words settle in her chest, but she couldn't back down now. The suspense was thick, and Ava knew the clock was ticking. Richard was still out there, and with every passing minute, the danger was growing. Whatever this hotel was hiding, whatever this system of power had been built on, Ava was determined to uncover it. The tension in the air was palpable. Every step she took felt like it could be her last. And just as Ava made her decision to press on, to dig deeper, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it Richard? Was it someone else? Whoever it was, Ava knew this was the moment when everything would change. The question was, would she survive whatever came next? Ava's heart raced as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, each step echoing down the hall with an ominous rhythm. Her body tensed instinctively, but she couldn't bring herself to move, couldn't tear her gaze away from the hallway where the shadow of someone coming around the corner slowly materialized. Was it Richard? Or perhaps someone else, someone even more dangerous? The footsteps stopped just short of where Ava stood frozen, her breath shallow and quick, and for a split second, the entire world seemed to pause. A figure appeared in the doorway, but it wasn't Richard. It was a man in a sharp suit, his face obscured by the dim lighting of the hallway. He didn't look like hotel staff. He looked like someone from another world entirely, someone important. Ava instinctively took a step back, her instincts telling her to run, but she couldn't make herself move. Her curiosity had overridden her fear, and now she was locked in place. The man stepped closer, his expression unreadable, and he didn't even acknowledge Grace, who was standing beside Ava. Instead, his cold gaze locked onto Ava with unnerving precision. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Grace, her face pale, looked at him for a brief moment before quickly lowering her eyes, her posture stiffening in submission. Is there a problem here? The man's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable sharpness to it. Ava knew instantly that this man wasn't someone she could ignore. Grace hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. No, sir, everything's fine. But Ava knew better. The unease in Grace's voice wasn't something she could ignore. Something about this man, the way he stood there, calm yet commanding, set off every alarm in Ava's mind. He wasn't just a random hotel guest, nor was he a manager. There was something much more sinister about him. Ava didn't know who he was, but she could feel the power radiating off of him. This wasn't the same type of danger she'd been facing with Richard. This was something more calculated, more strategic. The man's eyes flicked toward Grace for a fraction of a second, and then back to Ava. A chill ran through Ava as he stepped closer, as if closing the distance between them meant he could exert even more control. "I understand there's been some trouble," he said, his voice smooth but chillingly authoritative. Ava swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." His lips curved into a tight, almost imperceptible smile. "I think you do." In an instant, Ava felt the weight of the situation shift. She had no idea who this man was, but she knew he had some connection to the hotel's undercurrent of power. She could see it in the way Grace avoided looking him directly in the eye, in the way he controlled the room with nothing more than his presence. Grace, standing beside her, seemed to shrink under his gaze, her shoulders slumping slightly. Ava's mind raced as she tried to piece together what was happening. Was this man the one pulling Richard's strings? Or was he someone even more dangerous? Someone at the top of the pyramid? She had no answers, but one thing was clear. Her entire world had just expanded in ways she couldn't have imagined. "I don't appreciate people poking around where they don't belong," the man said, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't a threat, but it felt like one. Eva could feel the danger in his words, a warning that if she didn't back down, things could escalate in ways she didn't want to imagine. Grace stepped forward slightly, almost instinctively, as if trying to shield Ava from the man's gaze. "Sir," she was just. "No," the man interrupted, his voice calm, but filled with an underlying threat. "I'm handling this." Ava's mind spun. Grace was clearly afraid, and this man, whoever he was, held a level of control that made Richard look like a pawn. Ava's hand clenched into a fist at her side, the adrenaline rushing through her veins. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't about a bad interaction with a rude manager or even a systemic problem with the hotel. This was a web of corruption and power, and she was caught right in the middle of it. But the worst part, she wasn't sure whether Grace was a victim too, or if she was somehow complicit. Grace had spoken like she wanted to help, but her fear was palpable, and Ava wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. The man glanced at Grace again, his expression unreadable. "You're dismissed," he said flatly, and Grace quickly turned away without another word, retreating down the hallway as though she couldn't get out of there fast enough. Ava's stomach twisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something far darker than she had been prepared for. With Grace gone, the man's attention returned to Ava. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "You think you've uncovered something here, but you haven't even scratched the surface." Ava's pulse pounded in her ears. She couldn't tell whether he was trying to intimidate her or warn her, but it didn't matter. She wasn't backing down now. She had to know the truth. "What is it that you're hiding here? What are you really involved in?" His eyes flicked toward the closed door to the back office, and then back to Ava. "You don't know what you were asking," he said, his voice cool, almost pitying. "You think you're the first person to come in here with questions. You think you're the first to uncover what you think is a problem. You're not." The cold realization hit her like a punch in the stomach. This wasn't just about a few racist comments from Richard. This wasn't just about discrimination. This was something much bigger, something organized, something systematic. Whatever this man was involved in, it wasn't just a matter of poor management. It was something dangerous, and Ava had just walked right into it. Her mind raced, her breath shallow, as she tried to keep herself steady. She didn't know who this man was or what he was capable of, but it was clear now. She was in over her head. And no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried to find the truth, it seemed like the more she uncovered, the deeper she was sinking into a world she didn't understand. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," the man said again, his voice like ice. "But you will." And with that, he turned on his heel, walking briskly down the hallway, leaving Ava standing there, her mind reeling. There was no more doubt. This wasn't just about an unfair encounter or a corrupt manager. It was about something much larger, something much more dangerous, and Ava was in the heart of it. Ava stood frozen, her mind racing as the man disappeared into the shadows of the hotel corridor. Her heart pounded in her chest as the realization sank in. This was much bigger than anything she had imagined. The tension in the air felt suffocating, and her body was on high alert, every nerve telling her to leave, to run far away from the web she had stumbled into. But there was no turning back now. Whatever it was that she had uncovered, she had to see it through. She turned on her heel, her mind already working through her next steps. Grace had disappeared, likely gone to avoid further confrontation with the man in the suit. Ava couldn't trust her to give her answers. Grace had been too fearful, too quiet. But Ava had one last shot, Richard. He was still the key to unraveling this mystery, even if he was just a small part of a much larger, more dangerous puzzle. With determination hardening her resolve, Ava moved toward the hotel's back office, every step heavy with anticipation. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before her, but she was focused now, pushing through the unease and fear that had threatened to overwhelm her earlier. She wasn't just going to let it go. Whatever was happening here, she had to expose it. As she approached the office door, she hesitated for a moment. Was Richard inside? Was he the one orchestrating the real chaos behind the scenes, or was he just another pawn in a much bigger game? With a deep breath, Ava pushed the door open. What she saw inside stopped her cold. Richard was standing there, but he wasn't alone. The man in the sharp suit from earlier was there too, speaking to Richard in hushed tones. Ava's stomach turned as she realized they weren't talking about business or hotel operations. The conversation was far more sinister. The man's words were clipped, urgent, and Richard nodded quickly, looking far more anxious than Ava had ever seen him. "You need to make this go away," the man was saying, his voice colder than ever. "People like her, they're problems. They stir things up. And if she keeps asking questions, it'll bring too much heat. We don't need that kind of attention." Richard's face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. Ava had never seen him look so vulnerable, so small. It was as though the man in the suit had control over every part of him. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Richard wasn't just a racist manager. He was in too deep. He was afraid, trapped by forces far greater than him. "Do whatever it takes," the man continued, his voice low and menacing. "She won't be an issue for long." Ava's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to leave before they realized she was standing there, but she couldn't move. She was frozen, caught in the horror of the moment. And then, just as Richard started to turn toward the door, his eyes met hers. For a second, everything stood still. Ava's heart skipped a beat, and she realized they both knew this was it. This was the moment when everything changed. But before she could react, Richard's face twisted into an expression of fear, his hands quickly shooting up in a defensive gesture. "Get out," he said, his voice hoarse. "Now." Ava's stomach twisted in confusion. Why was he telling her to leave? Wasn't he the one who'd been part of all this? The sudden shift in his demeanor only added to the mystery. Was he really afraid of the man? Or was he trying to warn her? The confusion only deepened, but there was no time to process it. The man was now standing behind Richard, his eyes locked on Ava with chilling intensity. "We've already gone over this," the man said, his gaze hardening. "We can't have people like you digging into our business." Ava swallowed, every instinct telling her to run, but her legs refused to move. She had already come this far. She wasn't leaving without answers, without understanding exactly what was happening. "I want to know everything," she said, her voice firm despite the fear swirling in her chest. The man let out a low chuckle, the sound sending shivers down her spine. "You think you can handle it? You think you want the truth? You have no idea what's at stake." Just as the man moved toward her, Ava's mind raced. She couldn't let him get any closer. She had to do something, anything, to stop this. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy metal lamp sitting on the desk. Without thinking, she grabbed it, holding it tightly in her hand, prepared to defend herself. But as she raised it, Richard's voice stopped her. "Ava, please," he said, desperation flooding his tone. Don't make it worse. Ava's eyes widened, and for the first time, she saw something in Richard's eyes that hadn't been there before. Regret. Was it real? Was he really trying to help her now, after everything? Or was he just scared? Ava couldn't be sure, but there was no time to dwell on it. The man in the suit was already stepping forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said softly. "You don't know who you're dealing with." And that's when everything went dark. The room flickered for a moment before the lights cut out completely, leaving them all in darkness. Ava froze, her pulse spiking. What was happening? She heard a shuffle of feet and a muffled shout, but she couldn't tell where it was coming from. The darkness swallowed everything, leaving only her heightened senses to guide her. A loud crash echoed in the darkness, and then, without warning, the door burst open, flooding the room with light. But when Ava blinked, the scene had completely changed. The man in the suit was gone, and Richard was on the floor, unconscious. Standing above him was Grace, holding a gun. Ava's breath caught in her throat. "Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Grace looked at her with cold eyes, her face expressionless. "You've been asking too many questions." Ava couldn't process it. It was too much. She had been played. The truth she had been chasing was far darker than she had ever imagined. Grace wasn't a victim. She had been the one pulling the strings all along. As Ava's mind reeled, Grace took a step closer, her voice low. "You should have stayed out of it, Ava. But now you're a part of something much bigger. And there's no going back." Ava stood frozen, unable to make sense of the sudden twist. The stakes had just escalated to a level she couldn't even comprehend. Everything she thought she knew was shattered in an instant, and the chilling reality was that her fight was far from over. The truth had only just begun to unfold. Ava's heart pounded as she stared at Grace, still holding the gun with steady hands, her expression cold and unreadable. The room felt suffocating, the tension thick enough to choke on. Everything she thought she understood had been turned upside down in an instant. Grace, kind, seemingly timid Grace, had been playing a dangerous game the whole time, and Ava had walked right into it. Her breath caught in her throat as she struggled to process the moment. What did this mean for her? Was she just another pawn in the system of corruption and power that had been so carefully hidden? Grace's cold gaze never wavered. "You think you're the first person to ask questions," she said, her voice calm and detached, as though discussing something trivial. "You think you're the first to stumble across what's really going on here?" Ava couldn't respond. Her mind was still reeling from the shock. How long had Grace been involved? Was she working with the man in the suit, or was she part of something even bigger? Had Grace been sent to keep an eye on her from the beginning? The questions raced through her mind, but none of them had answers. Not yet. "I didn't want this to happen," Grace continued, her eyes flicking briefly to Richard, who still lay unconscious on the floor. "But you wouldn't stop asking questions. You couldn't leave well enough alone. Now, look where we are." Ava's head swam as she tried to make sense of the situation. The corruption, the secrecy, the lies, it was all connected in ways she hadn't even begun to understand. The man in the suit, Richard, Grace, it was like they were all part of some larger web that Ava had unknowingly stepped into. And now she was trapped in the middle of it. "Why?" Ava managed to choke out. "Why did you do this? Why me?" Grace didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her eyes narrowing slightly as if considering Ava for the first time. "Because you're the kind of person who doesn't back down," she said. "You're too stubborn for your own good." Ava didn't know how to respond. There was no anger in Grace's voice, no malice, just a cold, almost clinical detachment. It was as though Grace had been trained for this moment, conditioned to see people like Ava as nothing more than obstacles. In that moment, Ava realized that she'd been naive to think she could fight back against a system this entrenched. She had believed that the truth, once uncovered, would be enough to bring it all down. But she was just one person, and this was bigger than her. I'm not going to let you get away with this, Ava finally said, her voice shaky but determined. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've been doing. Grace's lips twisted into a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. You think anyone will believe you? She asked, almost mocking. You're just one more victim of a system you don't understand, and now you're a part of it. The words hit Ava like a punch to the gut. She had been so sure of herself, so confident that the truth would set everything right. But Grace's words lingered in the air like a cold, harsh reality. Ava wasn't just a victim of an abusive manager or a corrupt hotel. She was now caught in a web of power, secrets, and lies that went far beyond anything she had imagined. But that didn't mean she was going to give up. No matter how deep this went, Ava wasn't ready to accept defeat. She had to find a way out. She had to expose the truth, even if it cost her everything. Grace seemed to read the determination in her eyes. She stepped back slightly, lowering the gun just enough that it no longer felt like a direct threat, but still within reach. I'm giving you a choice, she said, her voice softening just a little. You can walk away from this. Leave. Forget you ever came here. I won't stop you. I'll make sure no one else ever knows you were involved. Ava's mind whirled. Was Grace actually offering her an escape? Was there some part of her that still wanted to help, or was this just another attempt to manipulate her? The stakes were higher now than ever before. One wrong move, and Ava could find herself even deeper in a situation she couldn't escape. But she couldn't ignore the truth, the whole truth, that had been slowly coming to light. No matter how dangerous it was, Ava knew she couldn't turn her back on it now. I can't walk away, Ava said quietly, her voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. You've gone too far, and I won't be a part of it. Grace's face didn't change, but there was a flicker of something, disappointment, perhaps, or frustration, in her eyes. She sighed, her shoulders slumping as if she had expected this outcome. I knew you wouldn't listen, she muttered. Before Ava could respond, Grace's gaze flicked toward the door. Someone was coming. Ava's heart skipped a beat as the unmistakable sound of footsteps approached rapidly. The door to the office flung open, and in stepped the man in the suit, the same man who had threatened Ava earlier. He didn't look surprised to see her standing there. In fact, there was almost a smirk on his face, as if he had expected this confrontation. He took in the scene with a casual glance, then focused his attention on Ava. I'm sorry it had to come to this, he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. But you're in over your head. There's nothing you can do to stop what's already been set in motion. Ava stood her ground, even though her legs felt like they were going to give way at any moment. You won't get away with it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll make sure everyone knows what you're doing. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Do you really think that's how this works? He asked. You have no idea what you're up against. And with that, he turned on his heel, signaling for Grace to follow him. Ava was left standing in the silence of the office, her mind reeling with everything that had just happened. But just as they reached the door, Grace hesitated. She glanced back at Ava, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. Ava saw something in Grace's expression, a flicker of doubt, a hint of regret. It was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to make Ava wonder, had she made the right choice? The door closed behind them, and the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance. Ava was left alone, but she wasn't without hope. The truth was still out there. No matter how deeply the corruption ran, Ava knew one thing for sure: the fight wasn't over. She would expose them. One way or another, she would make sure everyone knew what had happened behind the closed doors of that luxury hotel. As she stood there, breathing deeply, she realized that sometimes the truth comes at a cost, and sometimes the people you trust the most aren't who they seem. But that was the nature of the fight. Ava had entered a world of lies and manipulation, but she wouldn't be silenced. Not now, not ever. And so the story didn't end there. The truth would come to light, eventually, and it would shake the foundations of everything those in power had worked so hard to build. Ava had only just begun.